I will try to to convey to you in this talk a sense of what I consider to be the essential principle of all mystic teaching throughout the cultures and times, and that is the notion of the oneness of everything, the oneness of the self with the whole of existence. And I will do that by means of different works of 4 artists of the modern era that have been influenced by mystical thought, which are Casimir Malevich, Hilma af Klint, John Cage, and Agnes Martin. And furthermore, I will put their works in context with artworks of previous times from different spiritual traditions, so to illustrate how similar ideas have also led to similar visual and formal expressions throughout time. And the focal point of this talk is the philosophy part, so I will not go in great detail into the historic circumstances under which these works were produced, but will interpret the works exclusively under the aspect of the inquiry into this principle of oneness, what this is basically about. Okay, so nowadays we tend to have a great skepticism towards what is called the spiritual, because I guess we think of it as something lofty, supernatural, and otherworldly, or we think of it as basically the same as religion, which is in the worst case a dogmatic system of beliefs into something that just does not exist. We think of it as something opposed to everyday reality, as an escape from reality, maybe even. The word spirituality already suggests that for us, because of our century-long conditioning to perceive mind and matter as fundamentally different, as the spiritual and the physical to be of completely different things, opposing things even. But actually spirituality, as I perceive it, is on the contrary a focused contemplation of this experience here and now. It is the radical questioning of every belief we have concerning our own nature and the nature of reality. And in this inquiry into our direct experience, the separation between spiritual and physical is exposed as elusive, as merely abstract or conceptual. And the same applies to all other dualities, like the duality of myself and the other, myself and the world, or even myself and the absolute. So basically, it is the deconstruction of the duality of subject and object. This notion of the fundamental non-duality of reality is present in all the mystical schools of the various religions and beyond. This nameless primary oneness of everything has a million different names in various schools and cultures. It is called Tao in Taoism, Buddha nature or emptiness in Buddhism, Atman Brahman in Vedanta, the Hindu philosophy, God, we're familiar to that, the One or the Beloved in the Sufi traditions and Sufism, the Infinite in Kabbalah, which is the Jewish brand of mysticism. But it is always the same thing or no thing that these names point to, the intangible, formless and borderless oneness that is no thing in the sense that it is not graspable as an object, and that at the same time is everything there is. So when I talk about the absolute, I don't mean any vague supernatural entity, but I mean this living, ineffable, mysterious, and at the same time completely ordinary experience of existing right here and now. And that means that the realization of this oneness, of the absolute, which is the goal of mystical philosophy, is not necessarily some crazy esoteric event taking place on an astral plane somewhere in mental outer space after years of meditating in hermitage in the Himalayas or something like that, but it is something that can take place in the middle of everyday life. Because it's just realizing that oneness, undividedness, is the way things actually are, no matter what the circumstances are. So how do you go about realizing that? One of the ways that mystic philosophies suggest is the way of self-inquiry, of an inquiry deeply into the question, what am I? What do I take myself to be? What is the self? What is the ego? What do I mean by I? It is the question if there's really an entity inside this body that is separated from the outside world, or may it be that this is just an idea that I never questioned. So, in the beginning there was the black square, as we know. This is the famous painting by Kazim Malevich, which was done in 1915, and which is a cornerstone of abstract modern art, maybe the beginning of abstraction and one of the most influential artworks of the 20th century. And for Malevich, it had a very special importance. He called it the face of the new art, or he spoke of it as a living royal infant. And in the first exhibition where he showed this, he placed the piece in the top left corner of the room, which is in the Russian Orthodox tradition the place for the icon, the holy picture of a saint. And so this was a clear statement that this was a superior thing. This was a depiction of the absolute. So for Malevich, the black square was no nihilistic gesture, but the essence of his philosophy. He said, it was not an empty square that I exhibited, but the experience of non-objectivity. So for him, the black square is the experience of non-objectivity. And this term is very central to his theory. He wrote a rather long theoretical philosophical text, which is called The World as Non-Objectivity, and which was published in 1927, and in which he speaks about this idea of non-objectivity. And this goes far beyond just not showing objects in painting. This is not just another term for abstract painting, but for him, non-objectivity is a description of fundamental reality, of the ground of being. So non-objectivity means reality devoid of objects. Malevich says that, quote, amongst all the changing phenomena, the essence of nature is invariable, unquote. So painting non-objectively for Malevich is not a way of leaving reality behind, but of transcending an illusory realm of reality, where there are seemingly separate objects, and reaching the underlying truth of non-objectivity. So this idea that there are no objects could be understood as a radical way of saying that there cannot be one thing without everything else. The world of language and conceptual thought consists of many separate elements and events. So this is necessary for communication to happen. The name that we give an object or an event constructs an inside and an outside, basically. So we can deal with it. The inside is the thing and the outside is the other. But then when we take a closer look at this construction, it becomes difficult to say where the border between one object and another object, or one event and the next event, actually is. And we finally must come to the conclusion that a border is a purely conventional, a cultural agreement. So I think this is quite easy to see with events, like to say that abstract painting started with Hilma af Klin's first abstract painting in 1906, is just one way of looking at it, but there are many other possibilities of looking at it, of defining this, including going back to the Stone Age and say abstraction started with the linear pottery culture or something like that. Another example is like, when does a day begin and when does it end? Does it begin at midnight because we have this conceptual construction of 24 hours that make up a day? So does the day start there, or does it start with the first light of dawn, or whatever? It is clear that you cannot. It is completely depending on convention where you say that it starts and it stops. The same thing, like with this talk. When did this talk begin? Did it begin with my first word, or with Zlatka's introduction, or maybe with the beginning of my writing process, or even maybe when I learned to write about 2 decades ago, or a bit longer? So it is, or when did you begin? When did you start? Where do you set the beginning of that what you call you? Is it the moment when you are born? And this is the convention. We say, this is where I start. I was born on this day, in this hour, and from that point on I begin. But couldn't you just as well say that you begin in the moment of conception, in the moment when the sperm of your father reached the egg cell of your mother, or maybe even in the moment when your parents met each other for the first time? But then, when did your parents begin? So it goes on and on. It's completely a matter of convention to say this event starts here and stops there. So when we see that there is always an endless chain of causes for any effect, we see that the isolation of one event is a complete abstraction, and that in reality everything that happens is caused by everything else that happened before in the whole universe. And this is similar with objects. So we consider, for example, a chair to be an isolated something, a solid object. But physics tell us the closer we get to an object, the more it loses its solidity. On an atomic level, what we call chair has vanished into a fluctuation of energetic impulses in empty space. Because as you might know, an atom consists of to 99.9% of space, and only to 0.1% or something like that of matter, actually, matter. So what we consider as the surface, the border of the object, is not really a surface or a border. But also on an everyday level, an object is not really an isolated thing, because it always exists within a context. So we call this a chair, but for its being there must be the floor below and the space around it. And for the floor to be what it actually is, there need to be the walls around it, and you being there on this floor, and all these chairs being there. And for these walls to be there, and actually the whole building has to be there for it to be what it actually is now. And for the building to be there, this can go on. Everything has to be there for just as it is, so that the chair can be the chair as it is exactly in this moment, not as an abstraction, but as a concrete thing. So, while it makes perfectly sense to speak of a chair or any other object for everyday purposes, if we are to realize the oneness of existence, we must understand that our dividing of reality into separate things is purely abstract and conceptual, and that every tiniest bit of anything here depends on everything else in the universe to be exactly what it is. In this sense, one could understand Malevich's claim that reality is non-objective. And thus, if the word is non-objective, it also means it is non-subjective, because objective is a relative term and it just makes sense in reference to a subject. So a subject without an object is just as meaningless as the idea of before without the idea of afterwards, or the idea of a mountain without a valley. So we see in this black square, in this painting, a reduction to very basic principles, very polar extremes on the level of color. So it is reduced to black and white, the two extremes of colors, which are also in a way no colors that either negate all colors or contain all colors. And so through this, it becomes this aura of the universal and of the absolute. And also, of course, because of this form, the square, which is symmetric, which is the symmetry in all directions or in four directions, and it is in this sense perfect. So for Malevich, these two parts are important. The white is as important as the black. He didn't paint a black monochrome painting, but he painted a black square on a white ground. And this white ground, this nothingness, is just as important as the black square that sits in front of it, because it just defines the square. This is another painting by Malevich, Black Circle, which is also from 1915. And it is also this reduction to a very basic form and to the two basic colors, black and white. And the circle is maybe to the square that what black is to white. It is the other. It is somehow like the equivalent to this, to opposing things, because we just know of the squareness of the square in comparison to the roundness of the circle. So these two things define each other. And like the square, it is an absolute form. It is perfect, symmetrical in all directions, even more than the square. And it has always been used as a symbol for the cosmos or the ultimate or the absolute in different cultures. So what we see here is an etching from a book by the English mystic and physician Robert Fludd, who lived in the 17th century. And he was an exponent of the Western mystic tradition of Hermeticism, of which alchemy is a rather well-known part. And it is from a book which is called The Metaphysical, Physical and Technical History of the Two Worlds, namely the Greater and the Lesser. So a book about everything, which was published around 1620. And for him, this black square is a depiction of nothingness, of emptiness, of the inconceivable source of all existence, of that which another mystic who was influenced by Hermeticism, the German Jakob Böhme, called the Ungrund, the unground. So, but of course what we see is not nothing, but what we see is a black square. So but at the sides we see written et sic in infinitum. So that means like this into infinity. So the idea is that this black nothingness expands into all dimensions endlessly. And the question that this poses is, what is nothing? What do we think that nothing is? Like if we try to imagine nothing, we always fail, because the only thing we know is experience. So we imagine nothing necessarily to be another experience. And we might imagine something black or something white, which is of course not nothing but black or white. So, but with this idea of infinity, of this being everything there is, if we really imagine that, then maybe we get a closer sense of what nothing could mean. So, if everything we see would be in just one color, it doesn't have to be black, it doesn't matter, it can be yellow, and there would be no differences in this color, it would be completely even, and there would be nothing else to see than this one tone of color, and the same would apply for hearing. There would be just one tone to be heard, completely unchanging and all of the time, and there would be just one bodily sensation, and so forth. And most importantly, there would be just one thought happening, and there would be no reflection upon that thought. There would not be another thought that says there's only one thought happening, but there would be just one thought. If that would be the case, then probably there would be nothing. Because what we consider as existing is always, we experience that only through contrast, through change, difference. So this is like when you hear a tone which is not changing, you just stop hearing it. It just disappears, and you maybe sometimes you realize, oh, there's this tone. It was there all the time, but I didn't hear it anymore, because it just gets blended out of consciousness. So, this principle that everything is contrast, is change, has been in the mystic traditions captured in the symbolism of yin and yang. You all know that, this symbol, the circle with the S-curve, dividing it into two parts. One is black, one is white, and there's this dot of white in the black and vice versa. And this originates from the Chinese tradition of Taoism. But what we see here is a Western version of the same principle. It is from the work of the aforementioned Jakob Böhme, who was a shoemaker from Görlitz, not very far from here, who developed into one of the most read mystic authors of his times. And this is called the philosophical sphere, or the wonder eye of eternity. And of course, this is much more complex than the yin-yang symbol, which is visually very much reduced. But and this shows all of Jakob Böhme's complex philosophy, which draws upon Christian terms, of course. But the basic principle is the same. So here we have these two principles. On the left side is the dark principle, and on the right side is the light one. It is this bisected circle that is turned inside out. And in this diagram, the left side, the dark side, is associated to the Old Testament, to the God as the Father, to the wrath of the God of the Old Testament, and to darkness. And the right side is associated to the New Testament and to the Son of God, to Jesus, and to love and light. And these two polar extremes together make up the whole of reality, which is indicated through the big circle surrounding all of it. In this big circle, in the all, the everything, the play of these two polar opposites take place. So in this, the idea that experience, that means everything there is contrast, is shown. So we could say, for example, that we experience darkness only in terms of diminishing light, or we know that something is loud only in comparison to something quieter. And we know of the feeling of love just in contrast to feelings like fear and hate. So that means that we could never have one without the other, though we tend to play the game that this would be possible, and we could have love without hate, or peace without war, or things like that. But if there would be just one of it, it would completely lose its meaning. So there must be hate for love to be felt, and there must be getting old for the experience of youth to be possible, and there must be war for peace to exist. These two parts are actually one in the sense that they imply each other. So we see that the seemingly opposite parts of our experience are not really separate, but are just the way that wholeness, oneness appears. So following our three paintings by the Swedish painter Hilma af Klint, who is actually one of the inventors of abstraction, though she is not so well known for that. She's not as well known as the others, which is also due to the fact that she never exhibited her work during her lifetime, and also made sure in her testament that it was not exhibited until after 20 years after her death. She died in 1944. She lived from 1862 to 1944, and produced a large body of work, which has just only since the 80s been rediscovered, and 2 years ago she had a big retrospective that was also shown in the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. And she was very much influenced by mystical philosophies. She was a member of the Theosophical Society, which was very important for the culture of early 21st century. There was a group that was founded by the charismatic Russian medium Helena Blavatsky, and it was the Theosophic Society was basically trying to develop a spirituality that would be fitting for the modern world, and they drew upon Eastern religions and upon Western esoteric and occult traditions and tried to popularize that and study those. And it was really very influential for many painters and artists in the beginning of the 20th century, and for nearly every one of the artists who were involved in the development of abstraction. So Mondrian was a member of the Theosophical Society. Kandinsky was heavily influenced by their writings. And with Malevich it is not so explicit, but you can find many traces of, for example, Indian philosophy or things that indicate that he was, at least to some degree, he knew about Vedantic philosophy. So it was somehow present there in these circles. Here we see, of course, like it is a variation of the yin and yang symbol, and at the same time reminds of a portrait. Here's another one where we see this principle of interdependent opposites. We see the cubes, which form the circles, and then the black and white interchanging, and the complementary colors of blue and yellow. And here's another one of those. I'm just showing them to show a spectrum of the ways that it was depicted, this basic principle, which is very important in Taoism, the Chinese tradition of Taoism, and the legendary founder of Taoism, the sage Lao Tse, wrote about this principle in the Tao Te Ching. Therefore, being and non-being give birth to each other, difficult and easy accomplish each other, long and short form each other, high and low distinguish each other, sound and tone harmonize each other, before and after follow each other as a sequence. So these swans are they suggest that Clint was also occupied with Vedantic thought because in Vedanta and the Hindu philosophy of Vedanta, the swan is a rather common symbol. And here we have a yantra, which is from Hindu culture, they are used as a as a device for meditation. It is like the visual equivalent to a mantra, and it is like a diagram in which a lot of complex philosophical and spiritual concepts are put together. But we see things that we already know from the things that we saw before, like the square and the circle is in the square. We have these 3 layers of circle, and in the middle we have this complex form made up of intersecting triangles. And these triangles are a way to symbolize these 2 basic principles in Hindu culture, in this culture. They're the upward pointing triangles, they symbolize Shiva, and the downward pointing triangles, they symbolize Shakti, which are basically the male and the female aspect of the one, of God, of the Absolute. So there's a sexual symbolism in that, insofar as it basically shows that the union of the opposites that make the whole, they are creation. So more explicitly, this is found in Tantric Buddhism. This is a mandala from the 17th century from Tibet. And you see that the basic structure is very similar to the yantra, though there are much more, there are all these deities shown there. And in the middle, you cannot really see it very clearly, but it is something like this. So 2 deities in sexual union. So that basically means that wholeness, oneness needs the 2 opposites to be what it is. It is similar to the binary code used in computer programming, which can function to represent anything with just the 2 digits of 0 and 1 in different variations. And what we see here is are the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. The I Ching is the ancient Chinese divination book that is also known as the Book of Changes, and which probably originates around 1000 before Christ, so it's very old, and it is based on the same principle as modern computing, like on the principle of 1 and 0, yes and no, for representing the complexity of the whole of existence. So this book basically consists out of texts that were used to foretell the future or to give guidance and spiritual advice in difficult situations. And there are 64 of those texts, and each one is connected to one of those hexagrams. And these hexagrams are basically different constellations of yin-yang. So you could say that the unbroken line, which you see in the first hexagram, in the top left, they are just unbroken lines, would be the yang principle, and the broken line would be the yin principle. And these are all the possible combinations that exist with the, if you have this hexagram, the 6 lines. And so by chance operation, you can imagine like by flipping a coin, you get either yes or no, and you do that 6 times, and so you come to the hexagram that is appropriate for your situation. So this is just interesting because it is this reducing to the sets of yes-no operations to describe the whole complexity of possible situations. And also, this book of change was used extensively by the composer and artist John Cage, who based his works on chance operations that he did with the help of the I Ching. So here we jump back to the 20th century, to the 1950s, where Buddhism flourishes in a new surrounding in America. Zen Buddhism has had a great impact on the art of the 1950s and 1960s in America. And that was mostly due to one Japanese scholar named Daisetsu Suzuki, who was giving lectures about Zen Buddhism at the Columbia University, and many artists went there and listened to his talks, and he was popularizing Zen in a way that had a similar impact on the culture of those times, that like the undertaking of the Theosophical Society had an early 20th century culture. So for John Cage, this encounter with Zen was deeply important and informed all of his later work. Most famous is his silent piece, 4 minutes 33 seconds, which is from 1952, and of which we see the score here. So a silent piece consists of 3 movements, and the instruction for the musician for all of these 3 movements is tatset, which is a musical term meaning it is silent, indicating that an instrument is not sounding for one movement or one part of a musical piece. And so here it is not sounding in all parts. So this piece has 3 silent parts that have defined lengths that Cage minutely defined through using the I Ching, through these chance operations that were based on the I Ching. And for Cage, the term silence is equally important as for Malevich, the one of non-objectivity. And as for Malevich, the black square was no nihilistic gesture, but a profoundly positive statement. For Cage, the silent piece was not just a Dadaist joke, but the most precise expression of his philosophy and the most important work of his career. The piece is basically about listening. It is about giving all the attention that we normally would give to a piece of music to to that which we consider normally to be just arbitrary sounds or noises. So to the sounds that just happen by themselves. Like when you sit in an audience and there's the shuffling of feet or people clearing their throat or something. So this would be the music that was playing during this piece for John Cage. And it is also very much about revealing the other side of music, like the yin part, you could say, the part that normally gets completely overheard because it is soundless, it is silence. John Cage made a crucial discovery for his own philosophy and his work, and that was that silence is actually not an acoustic phenomenon. He went into an anechoic chamber, einen schalltoten Raum, and he was expecting to have the experience of total silence there, but instead he heard two different sounds, like one deep humming sound and one high sound. And he was told that this was the sound, the deep sound was the sound of his blood circulation, and the high sound was the sound of his nervous system working. So he found out that it is impossible, as long as you're alive, to have an experience of real silence. Our own body, as long as it is alive, keeps us from having this experience. Yet at the same time, silence is ever present where sound is present. Because John Cage could only hear those two sounds against the background of silence. So because there was silence, these two sounds were audible. But of course, silence itself is nothing that can be heard. But in this sense, you could say that the faculty, the capability of hearing itself is silence. My being here is the existence of silence in which sound can appear. So in this sense, I am silence. I am this space in which sound appears, but which is itself never heard. The same applies for seeing and the other senses. Like seeing, you could say, is the space in which objects can appear. Normally we perceive objects and we think they are the thing, they are it, and that's it. But they can't, of course, exist without the space they are in. So the space, though itself it is nothing, it is necessary for an object to be there. It's just important for it to be there as the material of it is. So in space is not something we can see, we can just see objects. And in the same way, silence is not something we can hear, we can just hear sounds. But space and silence, these nothingnesses, they need to be there for the somethingnesses to be there. This is a drawing by John Cage. I won't go into that into too much detail. I just want to show you he did these drawings and watercolors that are making a reference to a common motif in Zen Buddhist ink painting, which is the Enso, which is here we have an Enso by the Japanese Zen master Hakuin from the 16th century. And here's another one by an artist named Torai from the 18th century. And these abstract forms, these empty circles, they emphasize very much the importance of space, the importance of nothingness. They're just this simple form, and it just makes clear that the form just exists because there is the nothing in it or around it. And they call to mind the famous part of the Heart Sutra, which is an important sutra of Buddhism that is chanted in the Zen monasteries daily. And this famous part is form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So indicating that that which is absent is actually necessary for that which is present to be there. And this is a painting, an untitled painting from 1960 by another artist who was heavily influenced by Zen Buddhism, and that is Agnes Martin. She also learned about Zen Buddhism through the lectures of Daisetsu Suzuki, and she started her career in the abstract expressionist circles in the 50s and 60s in New York, but later moved to a far-flung place in New Mexico in the countryside where she built an adobe hut and lived there practically as a hermit, so somehow living the idealized lifestyle of the old Taoist and Zen sages. And Agnes Martin, she died in 2004, and she is best known for her grid paintings, of which this is one example. It's from 1960. And those paintings, they all show the very subtle use of color and symmetric geometry, mostly composed of lines or stripes, but always informed by the artist's hand, never completely accurate or coldly accurate. She was always working on the quadratic, on the square canvases. And her work for her was about expressing the perfection and beauty that is inherent in the mind. A text of hers called "The Perfection Underlying Life." And she was fascinated by the fact that we could see perfection in our mind, we could have an idea of perfection, though we never encounter perfection in the manifest world. And also therefore perfection can never be represented. Her work, she said, was about perfection, but it was itself far from perfection, because perfection is something that cannot be attained in this form. Because every representation, every object, and every experience is necessarily flawed, is necessarily, in a way, imperfect. As we've seen before, life is contrast, is change, is movement, is difference, and everything is impermanent. But perfection, to be perfect, must be total, unchanging, and ever-present. And this is, according to the mystic philosophies, exactly what the mind is, what consciousness is. This perfection that is not a thing, that is not in the manifest world, but that is still always there. There are all these sense impressions that make up what we call the outer world, but which is actually, as also modern science tells us, happening inside of us. And there are thoughts and feelings changing rapidly forever. But that which perceives all this change, all these movements, and often all this mess or all this chaos, is always perfectly still. Consciousness is, in a Zen saying, like the sky that doesn't get wet when it rains, and that is neither hurt by lightning nor disturbed by the light of the sun or the movement of the clouds. This ever-present, unchanging awareness that is the precondition for anything to appear at all is the perfection underlying life. Or as the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki put it, the reason everything looks beautiful is because it is out of balance, but its background is always in perfect harmony. So this mind or consciousness is not inside a body, but the body is inside the mind, is inside consciousness. Because all what we perceive of the body is sight, sound, smell, touch, and thought about the body. And those are all appearances in consciousness, where we never have the experience of mind in a body. And in the same way, consciousness is not limited, because all limits appear in consciousness, are perceived, are known by consciousness. And finally, consciousness is not personal, because everything personal, what we call personal, what would attribute to ourselves as a person, is also an appearance in consciousness, known to consciousness. So consciousness, mind, is not a thing, it is the knowing of everything. Emptiness, the absolute. Oh, here's another one of the grid paintings. And this painting is called Cow. It's from 1960. And it may be an allusion to a well-known topic in Zen art called the ox herding pictures, in which this realization about the nature of mind, of consciousness, is reflected. So this is from the series of the ox herding pictures in a version by Shubun, a Japanese painter of the 15th century. And these are the 10 ox herding pictures. So they are basically showing the process of Zen practice or of spiritual seeking, where the seeking begins, and then I won't go into too much detail, it develops, and there's this bull, which is basically a symbol for the mind, for consciousness, or for enlightenment that is chased. And there's the taming of the bull is taking place in the 4th and 5th picture, symbolizing process of meditation, of introspective, of deeply investigating into the nature of mind through meditation. And then the struggle is over, and the seeker and the bull are harmoniously moving in the same direction in the 6th picture. And in the 7th picture, the realization takes place that mind is not something, it is not an object. So the bull is transcended. And then there is this 8th picture where there's just emptiness, where everything is vanished. And this is the recognizing that even the self, the seeker, does not exist as anything besides consciousness, besides mind, besides emptiness. And this is besides this perfection that's always present. And then it goes on, and there's the recognizing that everything that is actually appears in consciousness and can't appear outside of it. So this emptiness that I am is everything there is the whole world, is the whole of existence. And in the last of these pictures, which is called the Return to the World, it's basically the recognizing that even the self, even the persona, the ego, is just, with all its problems, fears, and faults, this utter perfection of consciousness, just the expression of consciousness. And so there's nothing that needs to be transcended anymore, because it is seen that everything has been transcendence from the beginning. And Zen calls this moment of realization the passing through the gateless gate, because it is seen that it has always been so. And the one that imagines walking through a gate, he turns around and sees that there is neither a gate nor himself. So there's this character of Hotai, this guy at the left, which is now representing the seeker, and which is this happy homeless guy with a big belly and a bag full of goodies, meaning wisdom and compassion that he freely gives away to his fellow beings, knowing that nobody possesses anything anyhow. So, and for the thus enlightened, the absolute is all that is. We find this often reflected in Zen literature in forms of conversations in which a monk asks a master, what is Buddha? Meaning, what is ultimate reality? What Malevich called non-objectivity? And the master answers something like 3 pounds of flax, or the cypress tree in the yard, or even a dry shit stick, which is basically a piece of wood that in ancient China was the equivalent to toilet paper. So, and maybe from this perspective, we can more easily understand how Malevich could return to figurative painting in the end. So here we have a self-portrait of him in Renaissance style from 1933. And this return of Malevich from objectivity in his late work was often scorned upon by exponents of purity and abstraction, like he himself once was one. But with this knowledge that all is mind and that form is emptiness, we can see that the objective is really non-objective also. What Malevich actually also states in his theoretical work. So, and that the attribution of more value to one form above the other, the idea that some forms, like the square or the circle, are somehow more absolute than other forms, is now seen as a restricted perspective, as something that might have once been helpful on the way of realization, but must finally also be cast aside as an attachment to limiting ideas. And down below in the right corner, we can see that Malevich has signed this painting with a small black square, like a square symbol. Like he also did with his other paintings from that period, as if to say that I know myself in everything that exists. So I know myself as this pure experience of non-objectivity for which the black square has been a symbol. So when I paint a portrait of this body that is usually considered to be myself, I paint also just this experience of pure non-objectivity, because I am the nothing that is everything. Thank you.